Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining this event on digital rights and digital wrongs, from online arms and the spread of the far right to the perils of datafication and its impact on social justice, the final event of this year's wonderfully successful Media Democracy Festival organized by the Media Reform Coalition. The Media Reform Coalition works to bring together civil society groups, researchers and media practitioners to develop policies and campaign for media reform in light of communication environment that continues to be dominated by a handful of large, powerful organizations and is characterized by insufficient plurality, diversity, and accountability. I am Benedetta Brevini, Associate Professor of Communication at the University of Sydney, and I'm chairing today's discussion. Tech companies, or as I like to call them, digital lords, are now global monopolies with massive and unaccountable power over what we do, think, and how we behave and consume. Data they collect is used to inform policymaking, for government surveillance and political campaigns. The online spaces they enable have contributed to the rise of far-right groups, while culture wars rage around representation, free speech, and regulation, of course. Governments are now talking about how best to protect us from online harms, but what is online harm exactly, and can it be moderated without impinging on free speech? How can we hold the biggest tech companies to account? Do we need to break up the digital lords? How can we secure data justice? To discuss this and more, I'm joined by a fantastic panel of speakers that will help us understand these complex dynamics. We'll begin with Aurélien Mondon. He is a senior lecturer in politics at the University of Bath. His recent books are The Mainstreaming of the Extreme Right in France and Australia, A Populist Hegemony, the edited collection After Charlie Hebdo, Terror, Racism and Free Speech. His new book, written with Aaron Winter, is Reactionary Democracy, How Racism and the Populist Far Right Became Mainstream. Following, we have Alan Phillesum, who is Professor of Political and Social Theory at the University of East Anglia. He writes about British politics, political ideas, and ideology. He is currently Principal Investigator on the research project Political Ideology, Rhetoric and Aesthetics in the 21st Century, the Case of the Alt-Right. Then we have Lina Dencic, is Professor in the School of Journalism, Media and Culture at Cardiff University and co-director of the Justice Data Lab. She has published widely on digital media, resistance and the politics of data, and is currently principal investigator of the Data Justice Project. Her most recent publications include Digital Citizenship in a Data-Fed Society and the Media Manifesto. And we hope to be able also to connect with Emma Bryant, who is associate researcher at the Human Rights Program at Bard College in New York, and hopefully she'll be able to join us a bit later. So each of our guests will speak for about 7 to 8 minutes, and then we'll all come together for a discussion. If you would like to ask a question, please add it to the comment stream on the platform you're watching, and we will take as many as we can. So we start with Aurélien. As a growing corpus of research has demonstrated, as hate speech and disinformation have been deployed by far-right and extremist groups in online spaces to attack their political opponents and minorities in the community, how did the extreme right discourse become mainstream, Aurélien?
Thank you, Benedetta, and thank you for having me here and for organizing this event and this wonderful festival. Well, what I'd like to say first about the process of mainstreaming really is that it's absolutely essential that we look at it as a dynamic process. Too often, we tend to assume when we look at the far right and mainstreaming and the movement of extreme ideas into the mainstream, that the mainstreaming process works with the sole agency of the far right, with them being either media savvy, internet savvy, cunning, or even sometimes it is argued that they're tapping into legitimate grievances. To some extent, I think there is an element of voyeurism in seeing the mainstreaming as something that comes from the far right, solely from the far right, and the far right as this kind of risk to democracy. It's almost a reassuring feeling in a way that it is others who steal our enjoyment of liberal democracy, and if only if it wasn't for the far right or social media or these big corporations or even the people's irrational penchant for authoritarian politics, we would be fine. So it's kind of rejecting the blame onto the others for actually crises, which I would argue are very much within the mainstream's remit. Too often, blaming the far right for the mainstreaming, or solely the far right for its mainstreaming, ignores that discursive power remains predominantly in the hands of the mainstream, and that the mainstreaming process requires either a failure of mainstream elite actors or their complicity. So what we have looked at with Aaron Winter in particular, but also Katie Brown more recently in our research, is the way so-called traditional mainstream media, political and intellectual elites have managed to divert attention away from their responsibility in creating and compounding the many crises we face. And in many ways, they have also diverted from their incapacity to respond to these many crises, whether it is the environmental crisis, the crisis of democracy, disillusionment in our politics these days, and the rise of authoritarianism and corporate power. Instead, they have diverted attention very often onto the far right and their use in particular of new media. And I should say new media in inverted commas. And the far right and their use of new media becomes a scarecrow that justifies their position by claiming to be a bulwark against such politics, justifies the position of the mainstream. Think, for example, of the Washington Post's motto after Trump's election in 2016, "Democracy dies in darkness," as if the legacy media that the Washington Post is part of had not participated in making the situation that we had in 2016. One of the key processes, I think, to understand how mainstreaming has taken place is what we have called with Jason Glinos populist hype. Populist hype is focusing on the overuse and the wide misuse of the term populism, which has grown exponentially in our media to try and explain what is happening nowadays with the far right and how the far right is becoming mainstream. From our point of view, populist hype has three main consequences. The first one is that calling parties or actors like the Front National, Steve Bannon, and so on, populist has euphemized actually the politics that these actors are defending. It's taken away from more accurate but also more stigmatizing terms such as extreme right, far right, or even fascist. Just to give you an example, a couple of years ago, the Guardian newspaper ran a series on populism called The New Populism that lasted for 6 months. And they published hundreds of articles within these 6 months. And since then, they have continued publishing on this. And during these 6 months, they talked about a lot of things. Some of them were populism, and some of these articles were great, but some of them were something else, like the extreme right racism. And for example, on the second day of the series, no fewer than 4 articles were dedicated to Steve Bannon, who was, far more than a populist. He's a white supremacist. He has played a key part on emboldening far-right support for Trump, and so on and so forth. The second problem with the misuse of populism instead of other terms such as far right, extreme right, or even fascism is that it legitimizes these ideas by lending them a veneer of democratic legitimacy. It makes them also appear as the alternative to the status quo. We have the populists, which is the far right generally, as we forget about left-wing populism. And on the other hand, we have liberal democracy. So it's either the good old elite and status quo or the populists, and we don't want the latter. But it also creates a link between the far right and the people, and a much stronger link that actually is warranted when we look at electoral results. It makes the far right sound popular by linking it to the term populist semantically. And this has gone even further by creating false links between the far right, populism, and the constructed white working class as well. And you can think again of Trump here, or you can think about Brexit, which again is based on a very skewed understanding of data that is creating this idea that these parties are actually tapping into legitimate grievances, while in fact most of the population, whether working class or not, is certainly not voting for these parties. It also has a tendency to homogenize the working class and make us forget that actually the working class is incredibly diverse, far more than other sections of our populations. The third point, so euphemization, legitimization, and the third point is preventing us from actually thinking beyond the liberal status quo. And I've touched on that already. But the problem in saying that there is, on the one hand, the far right, on the other hand, democracy, without problematizing democracy, without actually trying to gain a critical understanding of what democracy is today in its liberal format, with all its limitations and all its failures over the years and potentially centuries, prevents us from actually thinking beyond that. And all we are doing is being defensive and ourselves reactionary against the far right, without actually thinking about more potential emancipatory avenues for thinking democracy and for thinking politics. So in this context, I think what I would think we need to combat this mainstreaming is a critical approach to the process of mainstreaming, which of course looks at the far right and combats the far right, but also looks at the mainstream and the failure of the mainstream and does not let our elite off the hook. And in terms of media, I think what we need is not to be so scared of these so-called new media and so on, but actually to kind of take a stand and create media that is not afraid of taking a stand in the culture war, not falling for the kind of far-right tricks such as free speech, for example, or bias and all of these kind of things that we've seen far too often on the center and center-left media at this stage, which plays right into the hands of far-right actors and of the status quo in many ways. So I'll leave it here for now.
Thank you. And now we move to Alan. Alan, you have argued pretty successfully, I think, that digital media are driving profound changes in contemporary politics, and that clearly they are driving also the production, reception, and dissemination of political ideas in a way that can foster online extremism. So can you explain to us exactly how this works, and also how the specificities of populist style and appeal to rhetorical ethos are intensified by digital media?
Thanks, Benedetta. That's a big, difficult question. Let me start answering it by just stepping back slightly and saying that the way I would approach this is to think about ideologies. So the kind of isms of politics, socialism, conservatism, we've heard of those kinds of things, the sets of ideas that help structure and shape people's political thinking in ways that are good, not necessarily bad, and that help us kind of bind to some politics that we then want to participate and engage in. So if you want to understand ideologies and how people relate to them, that in part requires understanding how people find out about them, the systems of communication through which they find out about and respond to and experience political ideas and arguments. And those technologies are really quite important and have important effects in shaping how people respond to and experience political ideas. Reading a pamphlet is different from watching a television party political broadcast, which is also different from watching something on YouTube or participating in a Reddit thread discussion. So these new platforms like YouTube and Reddit are, I think, at quite a deep level, changing the ways in which people encounter political ideas, and also changing the kind of experience of those ideas and how people bond to and relate to them. And I think doing so in ways that are really quite deep and have not been fully appreciated, certainly by mainstream politics. So let me kind of explain that really quickly, if I can, by using the old trope from procedural cop shows of means, motive, and opportunity, but not in that order. I'll start with opportunity, because I think there is a broader political context here to just remind ourselves of, one we know, but I think we should remind ourselves of it, which is that lots of people are, as it were, available for recruitment to new kinds of ideology beyond traditional conservatism or social democracy, because of the tremendous economic, primarily, uncertainty that there is for people in the world right now. People's occupational security has declined markedly over the last 20, 30 years, along with their income and status. Power in workplaces has shifted from collective bargaining to the kinds of rules-based management that we associate with contemporary HR and personnel management, for instance, but also because of technological acceleration that has made people uncertain and unsure about the kinds of jobs that they might have in the future, or their families might have. So it leaves lots of people, I think, very uncertain, experiencing what I call the occlusion of the future, uncertain about where they will be in 5, 10, 15 years' time, how their kids are going to live. Now, in that context of uncertainty, mainstream political discourse is really very unhelpful. It's not particularly engaging. It's certainly not very reassuring in terms of giving us a sense of where we're going as individuals, families, countries, and so on. Often mainstream political discourse is just urging us to accept and deal with the fact that uncertainty and change and risk are part of life now. And that political discourse is often very mechanistic, very generic and kind of technocratic in the way in which it communicates. So that's created a space for people, sometimes called populists, with the caveats that Aurelian's given to us, who deliberately break with that sort of political discourse and offer something much more dramatic, something much more demotic, that is really about, or that succeeds in part because it gives people ways of thinking about and understanding the situations in which they find themselves and beginning to act politically within it. So if you think about them, how digital media does that, the first thing to think about is how simply and obviously, but importantly, it massively increases the number of people who can be what I call ideological entrepreneurs, who can make a living out of promoting and communicating different sorts of political ideas. You can have a YouTube channel, you can be prominent on different social media platforms, you can make a living from putting forward political ideas, unrestrained by the professional codes of journalism or by the obligations to a political party. Your only obligation is to the audience that you want to sustain and maintain on a particular platform that you're using. Now, what that's given rise to is all sorts of new kinds of political discourse and genres of political communication, particularly on platforms like Reddit and on YouTube and on some of the social media, the Twitter-like platforms. Now, one thing to often misunderstand about these is that these are not lightweight, short, sloganistic forms of communication. What you find online, particularly on YouTube and other platforms too, is extremely long-form political presentations. Hour-long, hours and hours of YouTube videos, hundreds and thousands of words on different blogs and different threads, laying out a political perspective in detail, offering people an analysis of the situation they find themselves in, explaining what's going on, seemingly giving them things that they can do about their political and economic situation. And crucially, those platforms are also participatory and shareable. You don't just have to consume the video on YouTube, you can comment on it, you can download it, cut it, make your own supercut of it, you can become a content producer as well. And that can be part of how you show your political commitment. So what you've got then is a range of different forms and platforms that anybody can use, in which the motivations to use them are primarily individual and commercial, unconstrained by standards of public discourse, but also deeply engaged in building relationships of an intense and very effective kind with the audiences for them. So what you find then is, as I say, firstly, they offer an analysis explaining to you, why has your life changed? Why do you feel uncertain? What's causing all this unsettling stuff in your life? You also find specifications of who is doing it to you, who the baddies are, the liberals, the administrative state, the social justice warriors, the cultural Marxists, often couched in a very particular trope of secrecy and revelation. The kind of archetypal alt-right political YouTubers promising to tell you what's really going on, to tell you what they don't want you to know, the truth about what they're keeping from you. And that leads to a very particular sort of charismatic rhetorical style in which people are presenting themselves as experts of a kind who can explain to you the meaning behind events, the meaning behind this speech, what Joe Biden really meant, what Kamala Harris really means by that, why this is happening, why there are different kinds of immigration, why there's a pandemic, and so forth. Always promising you some kind of revelation that you can be let into, that will give you an insight above all the other people who don't really know what's going on. And that then builds up very intense and direct relationships between audiences and these kinds of ideological entrepreneurs. You get a kind of fan type relationship, which is kind of unusual for politics, really, in which people are building relationships with ideological entrepreneurs, with other followers of that particular person, creating their own materials, becoming different kinds of entrepreneurs in their own right. That's a very new way, I think, a slightly different way of being political, in which you can participate in this very direct way, circulating and promoting content that will help people, you think, understand what's really going on. So if there's an opportunity then in terms of constituencies that aren't really spoken to by mainstream politics, and there's a means of different kinds of individuals reaching these kinds of audiences, what's the motive for this? Well, I think on one hand, of course, it is straightforwardly money and power. You can become financially successful in some cases through this kind of work. You can also achieve a kind of celebrity, as Aurelian has said. You can go from becoming a minor YouTube player to being invited on to television programs, radio programs, other people's podcasts. You can achieve that kind of celebrity, as it were. But this is also part of a larger culture war, as people call it, which is also really a kind of class war. And primarily, I think what you find in terms of the shape of the ideology that's promoted online by particularly alt-right and far-right is a particular focus on the kind of culture, the class of people who exercise discursive cultural power, and an emphasis on their domination to the detriment of talking about economic class power and changes in labour markets and the ways in which things have affected your economic outlook. And there's clearly a set of political class interests behind that. So I think that what you've got then is this interaction between a platform that allows new people and new ways of communicating, connecting with audiences that feel unspoken to, that feel they are lacking in analysis, understanding of their situation, and then a new kind of discourse that can go along with that. It's really a combination of that articulation of a group, an ideology, through a platform that allows certain kinds of emotive explanations to be given for political situations, and then builds these larger kind of fan groups around it. And that politics is extremely mobile. I think that's one of where I kind of want to end, is at the point that this, on the one hand, can seem terribly specific and esoteric and about very peculiar and abstract, strange conspiracy theories online, but it's also sufficiently general that can be picked up by different individuals and applied in their kinds of situations. So the political discourses that begin in the United States about conspiracy theories, QAnon, Donald Trump and so forth, can reappear picked up by someone on Facebook pages from people in Norwich or Darlington or Bath or Bristol, using them to talk about things happening there. They can become big in France, they can become big in Germany. And that, I think, that kind of world of ideological contestation that is going on online is really hardly grasped by mainstream politics and hardly challenged by it. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. And now, Lina. I'll wait for Lina to be on. So you've written extensively on the politics of data and datafication, the extent to which data collection is informing government decision-making. So I am curious to know what you think is the role of governments, and what can government really do to protect us from this broad category of online arms? And is there a way to hold the biggest tech companies that I often refer to as digital lords to account, and therefore secure data justice?
Yeah, I guess my role in this is slightly expanding a bit on the notion of online harm beyond the sort of the content focus that we've had, that looks at the sort of circulation of content, and look at sort of more the, I guess, what we might think of as sort of the backbone of these platforms and the logics that dictates the way these platforms operate, and I guess particularly the role of data and data accumulation in that, and what that means for society more broadly. And often, you know, we can think about data as the raw material for platforms to operate. That's often how it's discussed, but perhaps also, you know, someone like Jason Sadowski has argued that perhaps it's more appropriate to think of it as capital. So in this sense, data collection is driven by this perpetual cycle of data capital accumulation, which in turn drives capital to construct and rely upon a world where everything is made of data. So, you know, platforms obviously are driven by this, particularly to increase forms of consumption. And so we see this also inform how businesses are organizing themselves increasingly around ways in which to accumulate data for that, but increasingly also with government who have adopted or have gone into partnership with companies to advance these kinds of platform logics. And we see that across lots of different areas of society. So very sort of, I guess, very well known or in public debate, of course, there's been a lot of discussion, as you also mentioned. Government surveillance is one area, and particularly in areas of sort of intelligence and security and law enforcement, has been very prominent to start adopting this idea of data accumulation as a way to garner control. And we also see it in areas like migration and in border management. But also, and this is the sort of work that we've looked at a lot in the Data Justice Lab, is things like in welfare provision and public services as well, where we're seeing the growing reliance or growing sort of drive towards what's often framed as sort of data-driven innovation, often in partnership with platforms, as a way to optimize, as it were, public services, based on this idea around particularly sort of ways of thinking about using data to essentially personalize or classify populations in particular ways. And we saw that, I think, accelerated also during COVID-19, where we saw the turn to platforms as being a solution to also health policy questions very prominently. and big tech is partnering up with governments, including the UK government, but governments really across the world. So this datafication really of not only our media systems, but across areas of social life have a number of consequences that perhaps expand our understanding of online harm. So at one level, I think it's sort of ideological in the sense that, interpreting people's behavior and activities as data points that in turn inform decisions about who they are or what they might do in future is premised on some very contested assumptions about the relationship between people and data, about the neutrality of technology, and also about certain definitions of social problems and solutions. And overwhelmingly, we've seen the use of data to actually sort of really reduce identities and lived experiences into new kinds of classification systems that then in turn determine access to services or opportunities, and redefining social issues as computational issues that therefore also delineate what might be appropriate responses. And this has raised a number of concerns about the role of data in entrenching discrimination and inequalities that goes beyond thinking about that in terms of consumption, but actually in this case also thinking about that in terms of governance, but also how it individualizes social issues by understanding social issues through data that pertains to people's behavior and characteristics, that this becomes the way in which we understand the cause, as it were, of social issues is through monitoring people's behaviors and characteristics that risk sort of turning a blind eye to more structural causes in society for social ills. And the other areas, as you allude to, is also a political economy question that, this onus on data accumulation has privileged platforms in central areas of public life that have in turn then become embedded in a way that has increased enormously social and public dependency on platforms as infrastructure. And we've seen this also accelerate during the pandemic, especially also as we've turned to life online, as it were. So this gives this infrastructural power, I think, is perhaps a different kind of power than we've thought about for companies before, that governments might have gone into partnership with, because this dependency makes it very hard, locks governments into partnership, but also locks, has power in the sense of being able to leverage consumers and users against forms of regulation, for example. And it also limits the possibility for democratic deliberation on how key areas of society should then be organized. Instead, we're sort of, because of this dependency, forced to bring more and more of social practices onto platforms as they scale, over which we then have very little decision-making power. So what does this mean for thinking about data justice? Well, I think sort of two areas that I think are important to think about. So one is in terms of regulation and policy. And I think here in terms of, as you ask about what can governments do, at the moment, the way in which this is approached overwhelmingly is through a focus on data rights in some form, whether that's sort of data protection, which dominates a lot in this area, but also other forms of thinking about rights issues in relation to technology, like privacy and other areas. That's very much based around sort of the individual subject, in this case, the individual data subject, which perhaps doesn't necessarily grapple with more meaningful engagement with justice concerns that actually can grapple with the kind of population level effects of this shift to platforms across areas of social life and the impact that has, and also including the impact that data collection and use in this way has at population level in terms of distribution of resources, but also in terms of possibilities to actually engage in decisions that govern people's lives. So what we need in terms of regulation and policies to think much more about is what it would mean to sort of look at institutional reform. And this is something that someone like Salome Viljanen has just written about, that talks about the need to think about sort of the institutional reform needed to engage with the collective dimension of data collection and use. So to think about more about how to make decisions or how engage in democratic processes around population effects, what kinds of institutional mechanisms are needed to facilitate democratic decision-making over the redistribution of benefits of datafication at population level. So this means a kind of shift, I guess, in meaning of data governance away from this very individual focus on individual rights and towards much more focus on the sort of institutional reform needed to facilitate civic engagement, but also general democratic decision-making around what happens to data. And then the other area is around what this means for mobilization and political mobilization as well, which is something we've thought a bit about also in the Data Justice Lab about, it would sort of engage with data questions, not necessarily as with a focus on technology at the center, but rather thinking about how technology fits with broader sort of social justice concerns around inequalities in society, around distribution of resources and goods, around questions of democratic decision-making, and integrate technology questions into that. So one of the issues has been, I think, that there has been a sort of a way of thinking about platforms and what they do as technology issues and not as sort of broader questions around social justice and democracy, which is essentially actually the kind of framing that they need to be placed within. So also how we might organize differently in a way that doesn't just focus on technology, but these broader social justice issues. I'll end it there.
Yeah, well, certainly moving beyond an individual rights framework is definitely promising. So I think we have so many questions, we receive so many questions, so I want to start immediately. Unfortunately, Emma Bryant, who is associate researcher in human rights at the Bard College in New York, cannot join us, but she will do a post-event interview with us a bit later, as soon as her connections is, functional. So, and highlighting, of course, issues around infrastructures once again and access. So I think that I want to start with a question that is definitely a big one that we constantly keep asking ourselves. And perhaps this question is for Aurélien and also Alan. So should progressives avoid culture wars narratives online, or should they engage with them? What do you think?
Go on, Aurélien.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Alan. That's great. Yeah, I mean, this is a difficult question, right? I think we don't have a choice in a way. I think we have to engage. I've read a few times already. Some people are saying that the culture wars are just bickering in a way amongst intellectuals on the left and the right, and it's all pointless. But I don't think that's true. I think the culture wars have a very real impact on people at the sharp end of these discussions. Think about the rise of transphobia and how, for example, mainstream it has become in the last few months, and how it is absolutely essential to fight back on these kind of things. However, having said that, we need to engage far more intelligently than we have as the left more broadly. And I think too often we have fallen actually into traps that were set by reactionaries for us. So, for example, engaging doesn't mean that we have to debate with reactionaries. We actually shouldn't debate with reactionaries. This is not what free speech is about. Free speech is not about having discussions and debates. These people are not interested in debating. They are not interested in being challenged. They are not interested in thinking things through. They're interested in pushing their ideas, really, in being platformed and in gaining legitimacy for ideas that had been pushed to the margins for a long time. I think we need to be far more clever with these kind of things and refuse debate on their own terms, and instead debate amongst ourselves, debate amongst the left what the strategies are we need to put in place, and really kind of prevent these ideas from entering the mainstream, rather than, again, giving them more platforms, as we've far too often done, particularly on the center left, where I think there's been a real win from the right when it comes to the idea of free speech, as this idea that you should have one speaker for, one speaker against all the time for some kind of objectivity or unbiased media, which I think is deeply, deeply problematic.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Alan.
Yeah, I think I agree with what Aurélien has said. I mean, but I guess what I'd add is, I think on the one hand, well, it depends what we mean by culture war, and if we're talking about issues around so-called identity politics, that's one set of things. I think it's important to recognise something slightly different, which is that in a sense, the kind of online alt-right or right critique of people who possess discursive power, that's not entirely kind of made up. There are people who have a certain power that comes from their capacity to write rules, articulate public discourses, and that does exclude all kinds of people. I think recognizing that there are kind of genuine inequities between a certain sort of groups that kind of control or have a prominent position in kind of discursive power recognize. Sorry, I'm very incoherent. I should point out I had the AstraZeneca virus yesterday, and Bill Gates's nanobots are playing havoc with my concentration capacity. Sorry about that. Anyway, the point is that I think there are kind of hierarchies relating to access to and control of cultural products that we should recognize as being real, without conceding ground to those who want to use that critique to push certain agendas that are fundamentally racist and misogynist. Second part, though, is I think when it comes to using the new platforms made available by digital technologies, I think that progressive, liberal, left forces are hugely behind the right in terms of understanding the capacities of those media and developing and inventing the ways of using them, the ways of presenting arguments and cases that can bring people to your politics. The key thing, as I was saying earlier, is the ways in which right-wing politics is giving people an explanation for their situation, giving them an analysis that they can inhabit and take forward themselves. It's a false analysis, it's a deeply misleading one, and it doesn't serve the interests of those who are attracted to it. But there's no alternative fully articulated, in my view, online. So there's a big job of work to do in terms of thinking about what political argument, political rhetoric, and ideological contestation looks like when it takes place online.
So I think that, I guess we'll follow up with a question that is precisely about how an anti-fascist media actually online would look like, an anti-fascist media system would look like. Another very difficult question. Who wants to attempt this one? Aurélien? Maybe?
I mean, yeah, I'm happy to. I mean, it's hard to know. I think it needs to be diverse in a way, and that builds on what Alan was saying. I think we need to be far better on the left and in all the kind of shades of left that we have with different kinds of media. The way the far right and reactionaries more generally have been, they've been tapping into lots of different networks. They've been tapping in lots of different audiences, and I don't think we've been quite as good. I think there's hope, but I think it needs to be. I think what we need to do is, on the left, is stop reacting in many ways. I think for too long we've been reacting to the threat of a far right, for example, or we've been reacting to the kind of loss of certain rights, lots of certain things that the left had won over the years. I think we just need to be more positive. I think we need to be more affirmative in our politics, and you know, there are some kind of promising things that are getting developed. I mean, last week, for example, Mediapart, which is an independent news website in France, posted that actually they are making a bit of profit at the moment, and they are completely independent. There's no advertising at all on the platform. They are doing some really uncompromising coverage and investigative journalism, and it works. It is working. They have more and more subscribers, more and more people paying for the news. And I think that is a very, very positive sign. Of course, is Mediapart an anti-fascist media? I think it plays a part, but I think we need to be, again, more creative. I think it only plays a certain part, and it opens up some kind of space, but we need to, again, as Alan said, to be much, much better at actually using the tools that are at our disposal, and there are plenty at our disposal. And I don't think that the big kind of social media corporations are necessarily in favor of the far right. It's the far right that's using them very, very usefully. So I think we can do that as well on the left, and we need to be better at that.
Well, certainly at the moment, especially in the UK, we have a list of new, incredibly interesting independent media, like the one that are supporting the event and the media democracy festival. So the Canary, Byline Times, Declassified, for example. So these are all, of course, promising new entities. And so now I want to move to a question on in the space of data justice. They're asking actually, how do you get people involved and engaged in questions about data justice? And I think, Lina, this is a question for you. It's a difficult one, of course. We always struggle to get also people involved in media reforms, and so data justice is certainly one of them.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the data justice debates actually build on the long-standing work that's been happening within media justice as well, that try to highlight the sort of relationship between media and social justice in all kinds of different ways. And I guess that's a lot of the stuff that we do as well. But I would say sort of one thing is that we try to emphasize is that, this isn't necessarily about being concerned with data. That's, I guess, what we're trying to say when we're saying, how do we organize in a way that sort of decentralized technology is. I think Cesar Gangararan from LSE also talks about it as decentering technology being key to this question, because basically one thing to think about is, we don't data isn't going to be the solution to everything, and in fact it can be very harmful in certain instances. So one thing is to think about how resources are being spent to solve an issue, or how problems are being defined in the first place, and why is it that data is in often cases being seen as being either a solution, or at least contribute to a sort of some kind of solution to a social problem. So maybe one thing to think about is actually, in a holistic way, what kinds of resources would help solve the issue that we're confronted with. And data can probably play a part to some extent in some ways, but it will not necessarily be the thing that people need to engage with predominantly. So for example, in the area of welfare, are we going to enhance welfare provision through more datafied systems and understanding populations, etc.? Probably not. It might be useful to sort of target certain needs, etc. But under the certain kind of broader policy framework we have, certainly in the UK, around thinking about social care and welfare provision, it is actually probably serving to be quite a punitive mechanism rather than anything else. So I would say to sort of engage with this question in the context in what we're talking about, right? What is it that data is being used for? And is it doing the job that it should be doing in that context? And if not, what are other ways in which we could solve the issue that we're confronted with?
And maybe because we have another question that is closely related to the previous one, which is really what can ordinary people do? So do you have, coalitions or active projects, that they could join, and petitions and campaigns that they could join at the moment?
Yeah, so I think, again, so taking the sort of notion of datafication in broader terms, maybe we can also think about it in terms of platform power and pushing back on that what ordinary people might be able to do. I think there are a number of campaigns that have come out of also the increasing power that platforms have during COVID. So, for example, the organization Foxglove, which is an NGO that works with technology issues, has tried to run a number of different campaigns together also with Open Democracy to try and, in first instance, get transparency around the types of partnerships that are being created between governments and platforms, particularly also, here we're thinking also software companies like Palantir that have worked a lot with in sort of very contentious areas in the United States as well, around immigration, etc. And but also with Google and Apple and Microsoft. So you have trying to get some transparency around that in the first instance, so that where they have worked on, but also particularly around how the NHS now is being linked up with a number of different big platforms. So there are a number of campaigns running around that issue in the first instance. But then there are increasingly also, we see a lot of initiatives actually being created with trying to elevate, I guess, citizen voices in this space. So things like citizen juries and citizen assemblies are being experimented with, where, to get a sense of what people want to happen with data and what's appropriate. The notion of creating data commons, etc., has been, is increasingly discussed. So there are lots of different, I think, ways in which people can engage with ways of thinking about how should we handle this idea of data use, and how can we, as I say, sort of secure institutional reforms that allow ordinary people, to have a say about how data is collected and used.
Thank you. So now we move into more questions. Actually, we have really a few about social media platforms and reform. And so they're asking, a few of them are asking, what reforms would you like to see of social media platforms? And should we ditch them, and should we imagine other type of social media platforms, perhaps with a public service ethos? So who wants to attempt this question? It is another crucial one. So maybe Alan or Aurélien, if you want to start.
Well, I can have a go at part of it, but I think but it's really more a kind of reframing of the question, which is, I think, on the one hand, there's obviously a series of questions to ask about regulation and ownership of these kinds of platforms, partly because of the kind of data issues that Lena's just raised. But I think there's a lot more work to be done thinking about how the design and structuring of those platforms generates certain kinds of outcomes. I think there is sometimes still a certain sort of naivety on the part of some of us when we think about communication systems. We sort of think that the platforms are kind of neutral. It's really about individuals' behaviors and their thoughts and so forth. We don't realize the extent to which platforms that are designed to kind of are designed to gamify people's relationship with communication, to make them feel competitive about getting more followers, more likes. The ways in which the kind of length of what you can write and how you can write it is going to generate certain kinds of ways of thinking and certain kinds of interactions. So I think there's a job to be done thinking about what a platform might look like that was trying to induce different kinds of behaviors that enable people to have different kinds of conversations that might allow them to work out differences in different sorts of ways. So I think there's a kind of combination of a sort of software engineering project. We're thinking about the nature of political discourse that could go some way to creating different kinds of online spaces. And bear in mind that forces on the right have been very good at creating platforms like Parler and Telegram and so forth to further their projects and to create the kinds of interactions that support that politics. And I don't think there are really things on the other side yet.
Do you have to add anything, any other idea that you would like to share? Aurélien?
Okay,
No, go ahead, Lina.
No, I just wanted to, I guess, emphasize this question around the significance of the ownership issues. I think it's the issue is, it's very difficult to do very much when platforms do have as much power as they do now, and they do have so much power because they get to dominate markets as much as they do, and that's social media platforms obviously just being one kind of that. So thinking about either that being breaking up or actually putting things into public ownership. I think, in order to sort of do the other things that we need to do, that question remains extremely pertinent.
Certainly. Aurélien?
Yeah, I mean, just to add to this, the point that I wanted to make was very similar. I think also bringing it into public ownership is all nice and well, but that would be thinking that things were better before we had all these kind of social media, new media, and so on. And I think again, it's diverting attention away from the fact that our media landscape and ecosystem has been dysfunctional for quite a long time. And the ownership of these big corporations that kind of have a hold on our social media and these various platforms is not all that dissimilar to the ownership of our mainstream media, and also to the pressure that can be felt by public media as well. If you look at the BBC today, is it doing a great service when it comes to holding people in power into account? I don't think many of us would accept that. And actually, quite interestingly, people on the left and on the right tend to agree with that for different reasons, obviously. So I think there's a risk in focusing too much on kind of social media as shaping our world and letting the more legacy media off the hook, even though they are still very much setting the agenda, including the agenda of what is being discussed a lot on social media itself. Bar, of course, the kind of more far-right platforms that are kind of dedicated to kind of different kinds of news. But I think more or less the conversation we have on social media is still very much dictated by what takes place in the legacy media, and therefore these things are connected, and who owns both is important, I think.
So, I mean, certainly you raised another important issue, because we have extreme media emergency also within the media system space in the UK, for example, in the US or in Australia, and we saw many attempts to reform, not very successful. For example, here we have a very important media diversity inquiry because of the incredible concentration of the media system and the incredible concentration and dominance of Murdoch that has now reached in the newspaper market above around 60%. And of course, then, it seems almost that we're blaming social media, and all the social media that, of course, are intensifying also the agenda of this big established dominant media. But not only that, also according to your own research. So, I'm curious to see, then what your thoughts are on another big issue, which is when platforms strike deals with established dominant media, as it just happened here in Australia, the first in the world, but probably other deals will happen soon. And we know that France was one of the first also to connect and to strike deals, for example, between over 100 newspapers and Google. And here, obviously, we have seen major negotiations and bargains going on between News Corp and Facebook and Google, for example. So what do you think about these deals? This is what also our one person from the public is asking. And is it going to be even more worrying, this new alliance between the media barons and the digital lords? So digital media lords and digital lords. Who wants to attempt this one?
I mean, I'm happy to have a go. I mean,
Lina, yes.
It's not quite my expertise really, but I think it is interesting in a way, because I think a lot of people have seen these kind of negotiations and deals that are happening as something worth pursuing in a way, because it is true that you know, Google and various other platforms are making a lot of money on the back of journalists. And you know, if in an ideal world the money went back to actually investigative journalists, independent journalists, and so on, that would be great. But there is a big worry when the media landscape we have is owned by very few people in various countries. And yeah, I mean, Australia is absolutely appalling, the state of the kind of legacy media there. So yeah, could that create more concentration? Yeah, that's quite possible. I mean, as I said, I'm really not an expert on this, but I could see it being quite worrying if we don't look at actually the media landscape itself. If we think that the only problem we have with the media today and the media and democracy today is the rise of social media, I think we're missing the point here. I think we've had a problem with our media landscape for quite a long time, and you know, the fact that we are not thinking through alternatives to the current political state of things is very much due to this kind of agenda setting that prevents us from thinking beyond the status quo in many ways.
Thank you. So unless you have another contribution, I'll move to another question, because we just received many. This is a very interesting one in the space of free speech. So to what extent has the defense of free speech facilitated hate speech? So maybe Alan, you want to take this one?
That's a tough question, I think. I mean, I'm too used to giving very hour-long lectures on the question of free speech to give a simple answer on this one. I think that the way I would characterize this in a more kind of abstract way is that part of the problems we have around speech at the moment are to do with the ways in which our broad media landscape is blurring the boundaries between different kinds of communication, different kinds of moments. So I think there are things that people can say in one context which are wholly inappropriate or going to be misreceived or going to be deeply damaging in other kinds of contexts. And that's a feature of the disruption of communicative environments that is caused by the fact that we are, you know, looking at things on the bus, in the back of the lecture theatre. There's no kind of stability about the locations and forms and kinds of communication that we're experiencing. And that's been ruthlessly exploited by those wanting to push a certain discourse of free speech, which is really about an unrestrained right to exercise power through discourse over others. But I think that in terms of thinking about that, one is to do rather more than just kind of take the position of simply no platforming or no regulations or restrictions on speech whatsoever. There's a much more complicated process underway, which I don't think is very well developed at this point. That was probably super unclear, but I'm sorry.
Sorry. So I think that actually it was clear, but it's also a debate that is seen very often Europe as opposed to the US, and in quite animated debates, I would say. So I'm moving also to another one, which is again interesting within the space of freedoms and free speech, because it asks, so if the government is becoming more concerned about online arms, and maybe perhaps Lina, you can attempt this one, will this be an excuse to bring an ID to sign up for social media and therefore having more control? What do you think?
So the question is the extent to which online a regulation of online harm is a way in which to garner more control over platforms.
On the citizens. Yeah, on the citizens, I will guess.
Yeah, through platforms. I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure. I don't know if that is. Don't know enough about the online harms bill and the consequences thereof to say whether that is what will happen with that. I mean, I think that's happening through COVID anyway, in many ways. So it's the idea of that will increasingly be signing up to various forms of identification systems for that reason. So I think, in whichever way it comes, I guess there is a move towards trying to create some sort of system through the technologies that we have. I mean, it's existing for, we should also remember that exists for huge parts of the population already. I mean, anybody who arrives on European borders has to be fingerprinted, for example. So there are mechanisms of surveillance of parts of the population already in place, particularly and also, as I mentioned, and what we see in welfare provision, there is a sort of, in order to get access to services, is increasingly conditional on providing or provision of data on people. So this exists for many already. But I don't know the extent to which this online harms bill is a direct link to that kind of system being put in place. Maybe someone else.
Yeah. People are obviously concerned about an ID and all of this, so they're keeping asking about these issues. But we do have many more questions also about specific platforms, for example. So they're asking, there are so many platforms that we might get lost in this new space of platforms to engage with even at the local level. And so how are we supposed to know as a public and citizens to know what is best to engage with? Do you have any idea how to address this one? Aurélien, maybe?
That's another tricky one. I wish I knew myself which platform is best really to engage with. I think what's important is to kind of to try and have a bit of variety. I don't buy into the whole argument that you need to necessarily follow things that you disagree with massively. I think of course there are echo chambers and bubbles, but I think we should not be scared to believe in certain things as well. And we don't have, I think, to follow far-right media to understand that they're bad and to understand what they mean in a way. So I think it's a question of kind of being critical in the way we approach the media and the platforms and knowing, well, not necessarily knowing how the algorithms work, because very few of us can know how they work, but knowing that they are algorithms, knowing, what Alan was talking about, what's behind the kind of power relationships that are behind these platforms, the ownership behind the media we look at, we read, and concepts such as agenda setting, for example, priming, framing, things that could be easily accessible to many people. I think it's a question of developing a more educated way of looking at the media rather than the media platforms themselves. And I think if we develop this, then we'll have a more critical approach to that. Some of the work that I've done, for example, on looking at the way public opinion has been harnessed to limit our kind of emancipatory projects is part of this in a way today. We use so many opinion polls as if they were just snapshots of what the people think, as opposed to actually setting the agenda in many ways and imposing certain beliefs on people. I think all of these kind of things, this kind of education behind how we look at the media is perhaps even more important than the platforms we use themselves in a way.
I think it's it partly depends what it is you want to do. The person asking the question, what do they want to do? Because I think there are issues, and we've sort of been raging quite widely around kind of things. Aurelian's talking about their news coverage and kind of critical journalism and general ideas about free speech. If what you're doing is thinking about, well, where are the spaces and places where people are finding out, are becoming educated about politics at a deep level, not just about who to vote for or what the policies are of this party or that party, but coming to an understanding of how society and economy work, then it seems to me that I think by some distance YouTube is a hugely important platform. If you innocently put in a question online, you want to know about science or vaccines or pandemics or about gender or sexuality or race or economics, you're going to end up going to YouTube pretty quickly, and you're going to find there people who've put a lot of effort into creating forms of communication to persuade you that they understand the truth about how the economy works, how this works, and so on. And so I think there's an awful lot of work to be done just on a platform like that, putting on things that try and explain to people how things work, that communicate a way of thinking and understanding about politics, economy, science, and so forth. So I think it looks different if you think about these things as a kind of broader sort of terrain of ideological kind of dispute, as opposed to when you're thinking about specifically news reporting and information, and that those are connected, but there's other things going on.
So I'm quite fascinated by these answers also because I'm myself thinking, because of the disenchantment with the major platforms at the moment, I'm actually more and more thinking and concerned about the idea of maybe going back to a sort of a public service platform that would be absolutely not, constantly collecting data. So, would be limiting data extractionism and continuous data collection, and will have a completely different ethos. Therefore, as Alan was discussing, for example, the specificities of social media that are actually facilitating far-right discourses online, probably, they will announce a different kind of discourse, to take place, and certainly not led by profit, not led by entertainment, and the continuous, speed, and then like super speedy pace towards clicks and clickbaits and so on. So I wonder if what you thought about that, and the idea of, is it too late? Is it something that cannot be achieved whatsoever? Or is it something that we should again consider? I remember a few years back, there was such a debate, and now it's been almost lost, even in Europe.
I actually think it might become back into favor. As you say, there's a disenchantment, but in Europe as well, there is, it will come out of geopolitical concerns, but there is, the notion of digital sovereignty has grown quite a lot in European policy debates, not wanting to be so dependent on US-based platforms or to be competing with Chinese platforms, so that Europe should somehow develop platforms that are more aligned with what they call European values. And it may be that there is in that context appetite for this idea of creating alternative platforms that have that adhere to these kinds of public service values. But I don't know that I see in practice the possibility to replace or to displace necessarily the existing platforms that are there now and that dominate. And I guess that would be the challenge in that regard. But I think, as you say, the sort of the appetite for alternatives seems to be there somewhere also at policy level. But I don't know how real that is.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'm told that we need to wrap up now. So I want to thank you, all of you, for participating to this final event of the Media Democracy Festival. And thank you for joining us and being part of all this incredibly important conversation that touched upon many issues that are all connected but quite complicated. And finally, the Media Reform Coalition, I should always remind you, is a voluntary organization that survives on donors. And for this debate, we'd like to acknowledge the support of the Byline Times, the Independent Media Association, the Canary, the Swan Box, Bywire News, and Manchester Meteor. And if you would like to support the work of the Media Reform Coalition, then please follow the links on the closing. Thank you, and see you next year.